Welcome to a quiet journey through a forgotten village, where a widow's gentle touch brings life and hope to doors marked by sorrow. In this bedtime story, you'll wander with her as she paints delicate flowers on the plague doors, transforming fear into beauty with every brushstroke. Let yourself drift slowly into a world of soft light, tender memories, and whispered promises, perfect for soothing your mind before sleep. The first time you saw her, it was a morning that carried the weight of an ending summer. The air still warm, but brushed with the faintest cool edge, as though autumn was waiting just out of sight. The streets were quiet in a way they had not been before. Not the lazy quiet of a village at rest, but the cautious silence of people keeping to themselves. Voices hushed behind shuttered windows. You had wandered out earlier than usual, following the slant of sunlight that spilled between the crooked houses, when you noticed her standing in front of the baker's door, her back bent slightly, a paintbrush held like something delicate, almost ceremonial, between her fingers. She was dressed in black, not the crisp black of fresh morning, but the softened, weathered black of a dress worn day after day, until it had become part of her. A white scarf covered her hair, tied loosely at the nape of her neck, and in the morning light it caught a thin glimmer, as if holding the memory of frost that had not yet arrived. You did not know her name then, though you had heard whispers that she was a widow, that her husband had been taken early in the sickness, that she had lived at the far end of the lane where the road turned to open fields. Yet what held your eyes in that moment was not the story you had been told, but the movement of her hand as it drew a long, curved stroke across the dark, heavy wood of the baker's door. The scent of paint hung in the air, sharp yet strangely comforting, mingling with the lingering aroma of bread that would not be sold today. And in that mingling was something almost impossible to name, a feeling like the turning of pages in a book you had thought was lost. She stepped back after each stroke, tilting her head as if listening, though the street around her was utterly still. At first you thought she was painting symbols, perhaps some mark of warning or warding, the kind that had begun to appear quietly in other towns where the sickness had passed through. But as you drew closer, you saw petals taking shape beneath her brush, each one opening in a slow unfurling, not bright or careless, but shaded with subtle colors, pale cream touched with rose, deep green leaves curling at their edges. It was a flower you almost recognized, something you had seen in the meadows beyond the village in the springtime. But here it seemed transformed, as if it had been dreamt into existence rather than picked from the earth. She moved with the kind of care that made time irrelevant, and you realized that whatever else the day might hold, she was not hurrying to meet it. You stood at the corner, watching the stones beneath your feet still cool from the night. Somewhere far away, a bell tolled, not the hurried ringing that called for alarm, but the slow, measured kind that marked the passage of hours. She seemed not to hear it, or perhaps she heard it in the same way she heard the sound of her brush, not as an interruption, but as part of the quiet rhythm of the morning. The longer you watched, the more you felt that the painting was not meant only for the baker or his absent customers, but for the street itself, for the air that would pass over it, for the way the light would one day fall on it when the sickness was gone. When she paused, she dipped her brush into a small jar at her feet, its rim stained in shades of dried color. And as she lifted it again, you caught the faintest scent of something more than paint, a sweetness, light and fading, like the breath of crushed petals. It struck you then that she was not only painting flowers, she was somehow making them feel alive. And you wondered if the smell had come from some secret mixture of hers, or if it had simply been drawn from your own memory, awakened by the sight of her work. Either way, you found yourself breathing deeper, as though you could keep that scent within you. She did not speak, and neither did you, though you thought about it more than once, about asking her why she chose flowers, or if she would paint another door, or if she had done this before. But something about the way she moved made you hold your tongue. It was not shyness so much as the sense that you had stumbled upon something private, not forbidden but precious, and you felt that words might scatter it like birds startled from a field. So you stayed where you were, letting your gaze follow each deliberate curve and stroke, the shifting glisten of wet paint under the soft light. By the time she finished, the morning had deepened into a kind of muted gold, the shadows shorter, the warmth in the air more insistent. She stepped back again, this time setting her brush down beside the jar and folding her hands loosely in front of her. She looked at the door for a long moment, her expression unreadable, though there was something in the tilt of her shoulders that spoke of both completion and release, as though she had left a part of herself there in those painted petals. Without a glance toward you or anyone else who might have been watching from behind their curtains, she turned and walked away, her steps slow, almost measured, as if she were walking to a place she already knew by heart. You lingered a while after she was gone, your eyes tracing the lines she had left behind. The flowers seemed to change as you looked at them, catching the light in ways that made them seem almost to breathe, their colors deepening and softening all at once. You reached out, without really thinking, and let your fingertips brush the edge of a painted leaf. The texture of the wood was rough beneath the thin smoothness of the paint, and for a moment you closed your eyes, imagining that you could feel the cool veins of a living leaf instead. Later, you would hear more about her, how she had appeared without warning at another door the next day, and another after that, always with her jar of paint and her quiet, patient brushstrokes. But that first morning stayed with you differently. It was not just the sight of a widow painting flowers, where fear had already begun to take root. It was the way she had seemed to belong entirely to the act itself, as if the rest of the world had fallen away, leaving only her and the door and the slow blossoming of color in a place where everything else was turning to shadow. And in that memory, the air is always warm, the streets always still, and the flowers are always in the midst of opening, never finished, never fading. It was 2 days after you first saw her when you noticed the second door. The air that morning carried a thin, misted chill, the kind that clung to the skin and turned every sound into something softer, more distant. You had risen early again, not because you meant to follow her, but because sleep had been shallow and restless, full of half-formed dreams that dissolved the moment you opened your eyes. The streets, still damp from the night, shone faintly in the pale light, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and wet earth. Somewhere, far off, a rooster crowed, but it was the kind of call that faded into the fog almost before it reached you. You walked without purpose, or at least that's what you told yourself, though your steps seemed to fall into the same slow rhythm you had taken to mornings before, when you had first seen her at the baker's. The door this time belonged to the cooper, a heavy slab of weather-darkened oak, scarred with years of use and smelling faintly of resin and smoke. It stood at the end of a narrow lane where rainwater always seemed to gather in shallow puddles, catching the light like tiny pools of silver. She was already there when you arrived, kneeling slightly so that her brush could reach the lower panels, her white scarf tucked more tightly against the nape of her neck to ward off the cool damp. She moved with that same unhurried certainty, as though the passing of minutes had no bearing on her task, dipping her brush into a different jar this time, one whose rim was lined with greens and blues, instead of the soft creams and pinks you had seen before. The scent of the paint mingled faintly with something sharper, perhaps the tang of pine sap, and you found yourself breathing in deeply, letting the smell settle somewhere deep in your chest. She was painting a vine now, its stem twisting upward in a slow, deliberate climb, each leaf shaped with a patient hand. The green was deep and quiet, almost shadowed, and yet when she touched the edges with a lighter shade, it seemed to catch some inner light, as if the leaves themselves held the memory of a sun that had not shone in weeks. She worked in silence, her brush moving in small arcs and careful touches, pausing every so often to step back, tilt her head, and consider what was needed next. There was no hurry, no glance over her shoulder to see who might be watching, only the steady continuation of something she had already decided would exist before the day was done. The cooper's shop was closed, of course, as all shops were now unless necessity forced otherwise. The sickness had made people careful, slow to open their doors, reluctant to let the outside air cross their thresholds. You could almost imagine the man inside, listening to the faint sound of the brush against the wood, wondering whether to come out or to let her finish without interruption. You had not yet heard of anyone refusing her, though you supposed they might have. And yet it was hard to imagine denying her the space to work once you had seen her. She seemed less like a person asking permission and more like an inevitable part of the day. The way the fog eventually lifts or the evening bells eventually ring. From where you stood, you could see the first petals beginning to take shape among the vine. Small bursts of white that looked almost luminous against the darker leaves. She added them with a care that felt nearly reverent, each one angled as though it had grown there on its own. The white in the cool morning light seemed to hold a faint blue shadow, the sort of hue you might see in snow just after dawn. Watching her, you felt the quiet pleasure of seeing something become itself, of knowing you were present at the exact moment beauty began to take form from the blankness of the world. She worked for a long time, long enough that the mist began to thin, turning the air a pale, washed gold as the sun finally reached over the rooftops. The puddles along the lane reflected her in fragments. A sleeve here, the tip of her brush there, her bent head haloed faintly in the shifting light. A small bird landed nearby, hopping twice before flying off again, and she did not pause, though you thought she might have noticed. There was a stillness around her, but it was not the brittle stillness of something held too tightly. It was the deep, breathing quiet of something at peace. When at last she stood and set the brush aside, the door before her had been transformed. The vine climbed gracefully from the bottom panel to the very edge of the frame, its leaves curling with a quiet elegance, the white flowers scattered along its length like small pieces of captured light. You imagined how it might look at dusk when the last rays of the day slipped across it, how it might appear in the deep of winter with frost along its edges, or in spring when real leaves began to push out from the earth again. It seemed, somehow, like a promise that seasons would still turn, even if the present felt caught in one long gray moment. She stepped back and looked at her work without speaking, her hands resting lightly together in front of her, as though she were holding an invisible weight. Then, without any sign of farewell, she picked up her jar and brush and began walking away. Her steps slow and steady, the hem of her black dress gathering a trace of moisture from the damp stones. You thought of calling to her again, of asking her why she had chosen that particular door, that particular vine. But once more, the moment for words slipped quietly past you. Some things, you felt, were meant to remain unanswered. Their meaning held like water in cupped hands, precious precisely because you could not keep it. When she had gone, you moved closer to the door, drawn by the pull of fresh color against the worn wood. The paint still glistened faintly, and when you leaned in, you caught that same elusive scent. Not just paint, but something gentler beneath it, as if she had ground a sprig of fresh leaf into the mixture, leaving behind the breath of living green. You lifted your hand and, with the lightest touch, traced the edge of one painted flower, careful not to disturb the wet surface. For a heartbeat, it felt real beneath your fingertip, as though it had grown there overnight, rooted in the grain of the wood. As you walked away, the lane seemed different somehow, though nothing had changed but the door. The puddles still lay in their shallow dips, the fog still clung faintly to the air, the rooftops still leaned toward one another as if whispering. And yet, behind you, the painted vine climbed patiently upward, a quiet mark of something unspoken, a reminder that even in the stillness of fear, beauty could arrive without warning, leave without explanation, and remain long after its maker had gone. It was on the fourth morning that you found her again, though by then you had begun to look for her without admitting it to yourself. The days between seemed to pass in a slow, dim rhythm. The village wrapped in a hush that made even the smallest sound linger in the air like a held breath. The sky that day was a soft, pale gray, neither threatening rain nor promising sun, and the air carried the faint, metallic coolness that comes just before the first frost of the year. You walked the winding lanes, as you often did now, letting your feet choose the path, though you knew in your bones where they were leading you. The streets had the look of a place paused between seasons, fallen leaves scattered in quiet drifts against doorsteps, their colors muted by the damp. You could hear the gentle creak of a sign swinging in the still air, and far away the slow shuffle of a cart's wheels over cobblestone. But all of it felt distant, as though it belonged to another time entirely. You saw her before you saw the door, that same black dress, the hem brushed faintly with dust from the road, and the familiar white scarf that seemed, in this soft light, to hold a glow of its own. She was standing before the midwife's house, a narrow building, with a low roof and walls the color of weathered bone. The door there was different from the others you had seen her paint, not the dark, heavy oak of the bakers or the coopers, but a lighter wood, worn smooth by years of hands passing over it, the grain running in gentle waves that caught the light in unexpected ways. She had already begun, and as you drew nearer, you saw that the flowers, this time, were unlike the others. They were small, delicate blossoms, each one a pale, washed gold with centers of soft amber, their petals so fine they seemed almost to tremble in the still air. She painted them in gentle clusters, letting them scatter across the panels as if carried by some unseen breeze, their stems slender and bending, as though bowing toward the earth. Between them, she wove narrow ribbons of green, so thin they were almost no more than a suggestion. Yet they held the composition together, like threads in a piece of lace. There was a tenderness in the way she shaped them, the kind of care you might take when touching something fragile. And you could not help but think of the stories you had heard, that the midwife had been tending to mothers and newborns even in these uncertain months, that her hands had held both the first and last breaths of the village. The scent here was different, too, though you could still detect the faint sharpness of the paint. It was layered now with something warm and sweet, like honey just lifted from the comb. You wondered if she had meant for it to be that way, if she mixed her paints with the memory of what each door held within. You could almost imagine her selecting each color, each curve of petal, not for beauty alone, but for the quiet echo it might leave behind, a kind of unspoken prayer in pigments and strokes. The air seemed to hold still around her as she worked, and you felt that if you stepped too close, the spell might dissolve, spilling back into the ordinary. The midwife did not appear, though you thought you saw a faint shift of movement at the curtain in the small window beside the door. Perhaps she was watching as you were unwilling to break the quiet that had settled here. You wondered if she, too, felt the peculiar weight of the moment, not heavy in the way of grief, but weighted like the pause before a candle flame bends in a draught, the breath before something is spoken aloud. The flowers grew slowly under the widow's hand, each one a small, precise offering. She did not crowd them or force them into a pattern. Instead, she left spaces between them where the pale wood could breathe, as if the emptiness was as important as the blossoms themselves. The longer you watched, the more you noticed the small gestures, the way she paused to wipe the handle of her brush with a cloth before dipping it again, the slight tilt of her head when she considered a corner of the door, the faint curve at the edge of her mouth when a petal's shape came out just as she had intended. She seemed neither entirely in this moment nor entirely elsewhere, but in some space between, a place where the world was reduced to the closeness of her work and the slow, deliberate unfolding of her design. When at last she stepped back, the door had been transformed, though in a quieter way than the others. The blossoms seemed to rest upon it rather than grow from it, their colors soft enough that they might have been there for years, faded gently by time and weather. It was a door you could pass a dozen times before noticing the flowers, and yet once you saw them, you could not imagine the wood without them. They seemed to belong to it as naturally as the grain itself. The widow regarded her work for a long while, her gaze thoughtful, as though she were measuring something unseen. Then she turned, lifting her jar and brush with the same easy grace you had come to know, and began to walk down the lane, her steps slow, unhurried, leaving the blossoms to keep their silent watch. You did not follow her right away. Instead, you moved closer to the door, letting your fingers hover just above the surface, close enough to feel the faint coolness of the paint. The scent of honey seemed stronger here, mingling with the woody smell of the panels, and for a moment you were reminded of warm summer fields, of the hum of bees drifting lazily in the air. The flowers seemed almost to hum with that memory, as if some trace of the season had been trapped within them, waiting for anyone who stopped long enough to notice. You wondered how long they would last, if winter frost would dull their gold, or if rain would blur their fine edges, and yet you found yourself hoping that they would fade slowly, so that their passing might be as gentle as their arrival. When you finally stepped away, the lane felt a little less still, as though something within it had quietly shifted. The blossoms on the midwife's door were not loud in their beauty. They did not call attention to themselves the way the bold vine had, nor did they open into the full, lush blooms of the baker's door. They were simply there, patient and steadfast, a soft echo of sunlight on a day when the sky had forgotten its color. And as you walked on, you carried them with you, not just their shape and shade, but the quiet way they had appeared, the calm certainty of the hand that had placed them there, and the sense that even in the midst of fear, something gentle could still take root and grow. It was the kind of morning when the light did not seem to come all at once, but in hesitant, delicate fragments, slipping slowly between the clouds, as though uncertain whether it should be here at all. The air was still, holding the faint scent of last night's rain, a scent that mingled damp earth, moss, and the cold, metallic whisper that lingers after storms have passed. You had not meant to walk so far that day, but your feet carried you beyond the lanes you knew best, toward the quieter edge of the village where the houses thinned and fields began to open like unrolled cloth. Here, the streets were narrower, lined with low stone walls draped in ivy, their leaves still beaded with droplets that caught what little sunlight there was, turning it into soft, trembling glints. It was here you found her again, in front of a door you had never noticed before, though you must have passed it countless times. The house itself was small and set back slightly from the road, with a sagging thatched roof and windows clouded from years of weather. Its door was not fine oak nor pale polished wood, but rough, uneven planks, the sort of thing made from whatever could be found and fitted together. The grain was knotted, the surface cracked, and the iron hinges bloomed with rust the color of dried leaves. Yet there was a quiet dignity in it, a sense that it had stood for many seasons and would stand for many more, bearing whatever passed before it. The widow was already at work when you saw her, her figure bent slightly forward, her scarf drawn more closely around her head to guard against the lingering chill. The jar beside her held colors unlike any you had yet seen her use, deep purples and dusky blues, shades that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. She was painting irises, their petals curved and folding over one another like layers of silk, the edges feathered into soft shadows that seemed to hold the memory of twilight. The stems were tall and slender, a green so dark it was almost black, and they rose straight from the bottom of the door, as if rooted in the earth beneath. Each bloom was different, some half open, some in full, velvety spread, and in the space between them she left thin traces of shadow, as though each flower had a place it belonged, and no two could be pressed too closely together. The brush moved slowly in her hand, its tip leaving arcs of color that deepened as they dried, until it seemed that the wood itself had been stained by the evening sky. The scent here was cool and faint, a mixture of wet wood and the sharper tints of whatever pigment she had ground into her paint that day. It reminded you of the moments just before night fully arrives in summer, when the air carries the last warmth of the day, but the smell of dew is already beginning to form. You stood at a small distance, close enough to watch the details take shape, but far enough that your shadow would not fall across her work. She did not look up, and yet you sensed she knew you were there, not with the kind of acknowledgement that breaks a silence, but with the calm acceptance of someone who has grown used to being quietly observed. The house belonged to the old musician, though you had not seen him in months. He had been known for playing the fiddle in the square on market days, his music winding through the noise of bargaining voices and the clatter of carts. You remembered the way people used to pause, just for a moment, to listen before moving on. Now the square was empty, and the sound of his music seemed like something from a story you might have been told as a child. As the widow painted, you wondered if she thought of him, if the curve of her petals echoed the curl of a bow across strings, or if the deep blue she chose was meant to hold the tone of a note that lingers long after the player has stopped. The morning passed in that slow, steady way that happens when no one hurries. The clouds shifted above, allowing the light to slip in and out like a tide, and each time the sun touched the door, the irises seemed to change, their colors deepening, the shadows sharpening, only to soften again when the light withdrew. The rhythm of her movements was unbroken, dip, lift, curve, shade, and it became something you could almost hear, as if the act of painting carried its own quiet music. A lone crow passed overhead, its wings cutting through the pale sky, and for a brief moment its shadow skimmed over the flowers, making them seem to bend under an invisible wind. When at last she stepped back, the transformation was not one of brightness or boldness, but of depth. The rough, weathered planks had become the backdrop for a small garden that would never wilt, the irises standing as still and tall as sentinels. They seemed at once alive and unmovable, their velvety darkness both comforting and solemn, as though they were keeping a watch over the door they adorned. The widow stood looking at them for a long while, her expression unreadable, and then, without a word, she bent to gather her jar and brush. She held them with the same quiet care she had given to the flowers, as though even the tools of her work deserved to be carried gently. You approached the door only after she had gone, your steps slow on the damp stones. Up close, the irises seemed even richer, the layers of color revealing themselves in subtle shifts, a hint of indigo beneath the purple, a whisper of silver along the edges where the brush had lifted. You reached out to touch the wood, feeling the slight unevenness where the paint had settled into the grain. It was cool beneath your fingers, but not cold, and for a moment you imagined the stems were real, that they would bend slightly at your touch. The smell of the rain lingered, mingled with the faint, dry sharpness of the pigments, and you breathed it in as though it might hold something you needed to remember. As you walked away, the image of the irises stayed with you, and you found yourself thinking of the way they would look in the fading light of evening, when the purples would darken almost to black and the door would seem like an opening into a garden that existed only in shadow. You wondered if the musician would return to find them there, and if he did, whether he would understand that they were for him. And you thought, too, of how the widow chose each door, each flower, as if guided by some quiet knowing, a sense of which color, which shape, which memory belonged to which place. It was not something you could explain, but you felt certain that whatever her reasons, each painting was exactly where it was meant to be, rooted not just in wood, but in the life that had passed through it. You remember the morning beginning with the faintest hint of warmth in the air, as though spring had placed a gentle fingertip against the cold glass of winter's window and breathed softly, just enough for the frost to loosen its hold. You step outside and feel the light spill upon your skin, not fierce or demanding, but with the kind of patience that allows you to linger without shielding your eyes. The cobblestones beneath your feet are still cool, holding the memory of night, yet here and there you see patches of sunlight catching on the uneven stones, gilding them as if each were a coin dropped by a careless god. The world smells faintly of damp wood and thawed soil, and from somewhere unseen, the scent of rosemary drifts, slow and deliberate, as if it has decided you are the one it wishes to greet this morning. It is on days like this that the paint in your hand feels especially alive. You carry the wooden box close to your chest, hearing the faint shift of the jars within. The clink of glass against glass that reminds you of wind chimes in a still hallway. You know exactly where you are going, though you do not rush. There is no hurry in the act of bringing beauty to a place where silence has taken root. At the door you reach today, the red mark has faded only slightly from winter's rains, but it remains a dull and stubborn wound against the gray wood. You place your hand upon it for a moment, feeling the roughness beneath your fingertips, the way the grain catches at your skin, as though it wants to tell you its own long story before you cover it. Then you kneel, brush in hand, and open the box so the colors are revealed like treasures from a chest no one else remembers exists. The petals you paint today are wide and open, the kind that seem to drink light from every angle. Their centers are touched with gold, the outer edges melting into a soft, forgiving cream, and between them, slender green stems rise like quiet sentinels. As the bristles glide over the wood, you hear the faint rasp of fiber against grain, a sound that is both work and comfort. The paint itself has its own fragrance, something mineral, something sharp and yet faintly sweet, that mixes with the dampness of the morning and makes the air feel almost drinkable. You find yourself slowing down, not because the work is difficult, but because the act of each stroke feels like a kind of prayer you do not want to rush. A passerby might glance, might pause just long enough to wonder who you are and why you do what you do, but no one comes close enough to speak. The street has a way of holding its breath when you are bent over your work, as if it too knows the importance of this quiet. You notice the faint movement of curtains in a window across the way, but when you glance up, the shape there is already gone. It does not trouble you. Some things are meant to remain half seen, like the moment just before a candle is lit, when the wick is still dark but carries the promise of flame. When the final petal is set in place, when the shadows beneath the leaves have been deepened with careful strokes until they look as though they truly belong. You sit back on your heels and look at what you have made. It does not erase the mark beneath it, never does, but it offers something alongside it, a small defiance, a whisper of color against the memory of absence. You know the people who live in this street, the ones who still open their shutters in the morning and nod to each other as they draw water from the well, have begun to notice these blooms. You have seen the way their eyes soften when they pass, even if they never speak of it aloud. The air has warmed further now, the sun shifting in such a way that it catches the faint sheen of fresh paint, making the petals glimmer as though a fine dew has settled upon them. You pack your brushes carefully, cleaning each one with slow, deliberate movements before returning it to its place. The box closes with a gentle snap, and for a moment you simply hold it in your lap, listening to the faint hum of the world around you, the flutter of a bird's wings, the whisper of wind against a shutter, the almost imperceptible sigh of the street itself. Before you leave, you rest your palm lightly against the door again, not on the red mark, but on the flowers. The paint is still soft beneath your skin, faintly tacky, and you imagine that in a few days it will be set enough to withstand rain and wind, at least for a time. You rise slowly, brushing the dust from your skirts, and begin your walk back, not in a straight line, but along a winding route that takes you past other doors, some already bearing your work, others still bare. The sunlight dapples through the narrow spaces between buildings, falling in irregular patches on the street, and you step in and out of them, as though walking through alternating pools of memory and forgetting. There is something about this morning, the particular stillness of it, the way the air carries the faintest promise of warmth, that makes you think of days long before, when the world had different worries and your hands were busy with other work entirely. You let the memory drift close, but not too close, like a bird that circles and never lands. By the time you reach your own street, the scent of rosemary has faded, replaced by the dry sweetness of freshly cut wood from somewhere nearby, and the quiet rhythm of your footsteps feels like a lullaby meant only for you. If you'd like, I can continue with section 6 so the story flows without a break in tone or imagery. You remember that the day began with a thin frost on the cobblestones, the kind that melts slowly, leaving darkened patches of damp that seemed to breathe in the pale morning light. The air had that still, crystalline quality that comes when winter and spring are not quite certain of their boundaries, when the sun is gentle but not warm, and the shadows carry a faint edge of cold. You walked along the narrow lane, the sound of your steps muffled by the uneven stones, past shuttered windows and quiet doorways, until you reached the street where the most doors were marked. The red paint had dulled over the weeks, fading into shades of rust and brick, and you could see where the rain had run in streaks down the wood, leaving thin trails like veins. You carried your satchel of brushes and pigments, as though it were something fragile, feeling its familiar weight against your hip, and you breathed in the scent of linseed oil, dry wood, and the faint temps of cold air. There was a particular door at the corner of the lane that drew your gaze again and again, though you could not have explained why. It was neither grand nor in poor repair, but something about its weathered grain, the way the planks bowed slightly with age, seemed to invite the touch of your hand. You set down your satchel and brushed the surface lightly with your fingertips, feeling the slight roughness of the wood beneath the smooth layer of old paint. The mark there, a crude red cross, was flaking at the edges, as if the door itself was trying to shed it. You unpacked your tools with the quiet care of someone unfolding a ritual, laying out each brush, uncorking the small jars of pigment, letting them breathe in the cold light before you began. The first stroke was always the slowest, not because your hand trembled, but because you wanted the paint to settle into the grain, to belong there, to feel as though it had been waiting for this color. You chose a pale gold first, one that caught the light like the skin of ripe pears in late summer. The petals began to bloom beneath your hand, delicate curves growing out from the dark mark, as if they were unfurling in defiance of it. The brush moved almost without your thinking, tracing the familiar rhythm of shapes you had painted so many times before. Yet each one new, each one shaped by the way your wrist turned, the way your breath rose and fell. The scent of the pigment was faint but sweet, mingling with the crisp air, and you thought of how flowers in gardens lean toward light without knowing why. When you stepped back, the mark was still there, but softened, surrounded by the quiet radiance of the petals, and you knew the door would not look the same to anyone passing by. A woman in a gray shawl came to stand at the far end of the street, her hands folded loosely before her, watching without moving closer. You did not speak to her. There was no need, but you felt the weight of her gaze, steady and without judgment, as if she were remembering something from long ago. She stayed until you finished the last curl of a stem, and then she turned away, her figure dissolving slowly into the pale light that filtered between the buildings. You wondered if she would return, or if she had only needed to see the transformation once to understand it. By midday, the frost had gone, replaced by a fine dampness that clung to the hems of your skirts and the ends of your sleeves. The street smelled faintly of bread baking somewhere far off, the yeasty warmth carrying on the still air, and it made you think of the kitchens you had once known, where copper pots glowed in the half-light and the fire hummed low in the grate. You painted until your shoulders ached, until the pigments in their little jars had begun to thicken from the air's chill. With each door you worked upon, you thought not of hiding the mark, but of altering the way it was seen, weaving color into it, the way ivy weaves into old stones, lowly, gently, until the two cannot be separated. As the afternoon began to soften toward evening, the light shifted, deepening into shades of amber and rose that touched the wet cobblestones with warmth. You paused then, leaning against the wall for a moment, and watched as the street seemed to hold its breath. The petals you had painted caught the last of the day's glow, so that they seemed almost to pulse with it, as if they were alive in the fading light. The air cooled quickly, the dampness sharpening into something that hinted at frost again, and you began to gather your things, slipping brushes back into their cloth rolls, closing the jars with a careful twist. The satchel felt heavier now, as though it had absorbed the weight of the day's work, and you carried it with the quiet satisfaction of knowing each door you had touched now held a little more light than before. You walked home slowly, past the silent houses and the empty market square, where the shadows of the stalls stretched long and thin. The windows were beginning to glow with lamplight, the smell of wood smoke curling into the air, and the sound of a single distant bell drifted faintly from somewhere beyond the rooftops. It was the kind of sound that seemed to come from a dream, half remembered and lingering in the quiet. When you reached your own street, the night had begun to settle in earnest, and you paused for a moment before entering your door, breathing in the mingled scents of paint, smoke, and the faint sweetness of something blooming unseen in the dark. You knew tomorrow would bring more doors, more marks to soften, more flowers to coax into life, and you felt no hurry. The work would wait for you, as the wood and the paint and the light always did, patient as the turning of the seasons. The morning comes in pale gold, the kind that drapes itself gently across the cobblestones, as though it, too, is tired of moving quickly. You find yourself once again at the edge of the lane, brush in hand, the bristles softened from years of use, the wooden handle worn to the shape of your grip. The air is cool and faintly sweet, with the scent of dew settling on ivy leaves, though beneath it lies the faint, metallic tang of the lime wash the town has begun spreading on the older houses in hopes of keeping the sickness at bay. You stand still for a long while before you begin, listening to the faraway sound of someone drawing water from a well, the creak of the rope echoing through the silence, the slow, hollow splash as the bucket meets the surface. Only then do you kneel before the door marked with its grim sign, the chalked cross that has begun to fade under last night's mist, and dip your brush into the small clay bowl at your feet where colors swirl like captured fragments of sunrise. The wood beneath your touch feels thirsty, drinking in each stroke of pigment, as though it has been waiting for this moment, for the cool wetness of paint to replace the rough dryness left by seasons of weather. You do not hurry, for the flowers you lay upon the plague door are not meant to distract the living from their grief, but to speak softly to it, to offer it a place to rest. The petals bloom slowly under your hand first, the faint curve of a stem, then the opening of something delicate at its crown, until it becomes a blossom with edges that seem to curl toward the light. You choose colors that do not shout, muted pinks, dusty blues, the pale cream of wild roses, as though each hue has been left in the sun for a summer and has learned how to be gentle. As you work, you feel the eyes of the empty house on you, the way its windows, clouded with age, seem to be listening. And you speak to it in the only language you know, the quiet language of color and shape. Sometimes, while you paint, the wind carries with it fragments of sound from other streets, the tapping of a distant hammer, the hushed murmur of voices, trading news too heavy to carry alone. Yet here, in the narrow ribbon of shadow between this house and the next, those sounds are softened, as though time has slowed its breathing. You remember when this door was not marked, when its planks shone with the gloss of fresh oil, and children would dart in and out, their laughter spilling like a river into the road. You recall the warm smell of bread drifting from its kitchen window, the shape of the curtains fluttering in the summer air. Those memories are not yours entirely, yet they have taken root in you over years of passing by, the way vines claim the walls they lean upon. Now they guide your hand as you bring each flower to life, the brush lifting, dipping, returning, like the steady rhythm of a lullaby. The work takes the better part of the morning, and the light shifts as you move, deepening the shadows around your feet while warming the paint on the door. You pause to stretch your fingers, feeling the soft stiffness that comes from long concentration, and take a moment to breathe in the air that smells faintly of wet stone and distant baking. A cat passes silently behind you, its fur brushing against your skirts before disappearing into the tangle of alleyways. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a church bell tolls a slow, solitary note, and for a moment it feels less like a call to service than a reminder that the world is still turning, even in its quietest hours. You dip your brush once more, adding a final arc of green to the cluster of leaves, letting the bristles splay slightly so the edges blur as they might in the softness of nature. When the last flower is finished, you do not step away immediately. Instead, you remain before the door, brush dangling loosely in your hand, and look at what you have made. It is not perfect, no blossom ever is, but it carries something of the morning in its shape, something of the way light leans into shadow without fear. You know that the family who once lived here will not return, that the door may one day be taken down entirely. Yet in this moment, it holds a beauty that was not there before, a beauty that does not ask for witness or applause. You think of the other doors waiting for you, the other marks that must be softened, and for a brief instant you feel the weight of them all, like a row of unlit candles waiting for flame. Then you gather your things, the clay bowl, the rag you use to wipe your hands, the jar of water now cloudy with the mingling of colors, and rise slowly, your knees stiff from kneeling on the cobblestones. As you walk away, the lane seems to hold its breath, the painted door glowing faintly in the dappled light, like a pressed flower kept in a beloved book. The sound of your footsteps echoes softly, mixing with the rustle of leaves overhead and the distant hum of a town learning how to live inside its own stillness. You do not look back, for you have learned that the act of leaving is part of the work, that flowers are meant to be left behind for others to find when they need them, And so you carry the quiet with you, letting it settle into your bones like the cool of shade on a long summer afternoon, knowing that tomorrow or the day after you will kneel before another door. And the brush will find its rhythm again, and the petals will open in their slow, unhurried way. You remember the way the air felt that evening, when the wind moved slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the dust that lay in soft drifts along the cobblestones. The sun had already sunk behind the chimneys, but the afterglow lingered in a muted haze, painting the sky in shades of rose and lavender that deepened with every passing breath. You were standing at the far end of the lane, the place where the houses leaned toward one another like weary friends, their eaves almost touching above your head. The street was quiet, not in the way that invites you to rest, but in that deeper, stranger quiet that comes when there are too few hearts left to make a sound. You could hear only your own footsteps and the faint, uneven tapping from somewhere ahead. The familiar music of her paintbrush finding its rhythm. You walked slowly, your hand trailing along the cold wall of the apothecary, feeling the rough texture of the stone beneath your fingertips, each indentation filled with the grit of years. The air smelled faintly of soot and rosemary, a ghost of some herbal fire long extinguished. In the distance, her small figure was bent toward another door, her head tilted, her hand rising and falling with the steady grace of someone who had made peace with repetition. She did not look up as you approached, but you knew she was aware of you. She always seemed to know when someone was near, even in the dimmest light. The door she worked on tonight was older than most, its wood splintered and bowed with age. A faded mark had been scratched there weeks ago, a crude sign meant to warn the living away, but she had begun to hide such symbols beneath layers of gentle color. On this one, she was painting lilacs, pale clusters of soft violet and white, each petal unfolding like a whisper. You watched the way her brush moved, as if it were not merely adding color, but coaxing the wood to remember something it had forgotten. A season before sickness, a season when a door opened to laughter instead of silence. The paint was still wet, glistening faintly in the last of the evening's glow, and the scent of linseed oil mingled with the faint perfume of crushed petals she sometimes carried in her apron. She paused only to dip her brush, and for a moment the lane seemed to hold its breath. You became aware of the stillness in a new way, how even the air seemed thick, how the faint breeze carried no sound of voices or carts, only the sigh of leaves against the wall. There was something almost ceremonial in the way she worked, the steady patience of each stroke, as though the flowers had to grow under her hand before they could be left behind. She leaned closer to add a shadow to one petal, and you noticed how her fingers were stained from earlier work, faint traces of pink and blue beneath her nails. She never cleaned them fully. She carried the colors with her, the way other people might carry a locket or a prayer. When she finally stepped back, you could see the door anew, the lilacs climbing in a gentle arch, as if they had been there for years, their pale blossoms almost luminous in the deepening twilight. The crude warning mark was gone, not erased, but transformed, hidden under a softness that would meet the eyes of any passerby instead of the blunt reminder of loss. You asked her quietly why lilacs for this door, and she smiled without turning, her gaze still fixed on the painted blossoms. Because, she said after a pause, this was the house where they used to bloom in spring. The window boxes were always full, even in the years when others forgot to plant. Her voice was not heavy with sadness. It was almost like a lullaby, carrying a memory as gently as a piece of porcelain in two cupped hands. You stayed beside her as the light continued to fade, watching as she cleaned the last of the paint from her brush with slow, deliberate motions. She wrapped the brush in a piece of cloth and tied it neatly, then tucked it away in her satchel. The sky had grown deeper now, the first pale stars appearing above the chimney tops, and the air had turned cool enough for your breath to show in faint silver clouds. She did not hurry. Instead, she stood for a long while in front of the painted door, as if offering it a silent farewell before she turned to go. You followed her steps down the lane, the sound of your feet barely touching the quiet, the scent of lilacs lingering behind you like a memory that would not fade too quickly. There was something about that night, the slow rhythm of her movements, the muted colors in the air, the way each door she touched seemed less like a barrier and more like a threshold to something unseen. You felt, though you could not have explained it, that the flowers she left behind were not only for those who had gone, but for those who still walked these streets, to remind them that beauty could still take root in the cracks left by sorrow. And as you reached the turning in the lane where the houses gave way to open air, you glanced back and saw the lilacs faintly glowing against the darkness, like a small piece of spring that had decided to stay and keep watch through the night. You step quietly into the cool shade of early evening, where the last light of day falls soft and low, brushing the worn cobblestones with a gentle, golden touch that seems almost too delicate to hold. The air is rich with the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of flowering hedgerows edging the village outskirts, their quiet perfume mingling with the subtle smoke of distant hearth fires beginning to awaken against the coming night. You find yourself drawn to a narrow lane you have seldom walked before, where the walls lean close like old friends sharing secrets, and the faintest breeze carries whispers of forgotten voices. There, almost hidden beneath a sagging porch, is a door whose wood bears the rough marks of time, its surface uneven and splintered, as if it holds the very memory of the years pressed into its grain. You set your satchel down beside you, the soft clink of glass jars settling into place like a muted melody. Your fingers brush over the worn handle of a brush, its bristles supple and familiar, and as you lift it, you feel the steady rhythm of your own breath guiding your hand. The door is marked, faintly yet unmistakably, with the telltale red cross, a somber badge of absence, a sign once meant to guard against unwanted entry. But now, beneath your touch, it is slowly becoming something else, a canvas for gentle beauty, a soft offering to the silence that has settled here. You dip your brush into a bowl of muted blues and pale lavenders, colors chosen to echo the twilight sky above and the delicate petals of wildflowers growing just beyond the village walls. Each stroke is slow and deliberate, a careful unfolding of petals that seem to bloom in real time, opening to catch the fading light as if reaching for some distant warmth. You feel the texture of the wood beneath your fingertips, rough yet forgiving, absorbing the paint like thirsty soil taking in rain. The scent of linseed oil and crushed leaves drifts faintly from your work, mingling with the cool evening air, while the soft murmur of distant voices and the rustling of leaves create a quiet symphony around you. Your brush moves with a grace that feels almost like a dance, a slow weaving of life into the place where grief once stood, stark and bare. The flowers you paint tonight, are violets, small and humble, their petals a tender mixture of deep purple and soft lilac, crowned with a shimmer of silver dew. They seem to cluster close together on the door, as if huddling for warmth against the encroaching night. And the slender green stems twist and curl with an elegance born from the earth itself. You think of the families who once lived here, the laughter that might have echoed through these walls before silence claimed them. And you imagine the violets as quiet witnesses, standing guard in bloom. The door, transformed, no longer feels like a barrier, but a gentle threshold, a promise that even in absence, there is space for beauty to grow. As you pause to wipe your brush on a cloth, the cool air brushes your cheek like a whispered farewell, carrying with it the soft scent of wood smoke and distant lavender fields. You look up, noticing how the fading light pools in the cracked panes of the neighboring windows, casting long shadows that sway gently with the evening breeze. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolls softly, its sound rolling like a lullaby through the village streets. And you feel a quiet comfort settle in your chest. The painted violets seem to glow faintly in this light, their colors deepening as if the door itself breathes with a new kind of life, a life shaped by memory and the tender touch of your hand. When the last petal is set, you gather your brushes and close your satchel with care, the sound soft in the hushed lane. You stand for a moment longer, your gaze lingering on the door as if to commit its new form to memory, before turning slowly toward home. The path is quiet beneath your feet, the air cool and sweet, and you carry with you the stillness of the evening, the lingering scent of violets, and the gentle assurance that beauty can be born even from the shadows of loss. The evening settles softly, as if the very air is sighing under the weight of twilight's gentle embrace. You find yourself wandering slowly along a path worn smooth by countless footsteps, the cobblestones cool beneath your soles and darkened by the hush of approaching night. The sky above has turned a muted shade of indigo, where the faintest stars begin to peak, shy and steady, like distant lanterns glowing through a veil of mist. A faint breeze carries with it the scent of damp earth and the lingering sweetness of late-blooming jasmine, weaving through the narrow streets like a tender memory brushing past your skin. You feel the weight of the satchel on your shoulder, its familiar presence grounding you even as your thoughts drift toward the quiet door ahead, waiting patiently for your touch. The door itself is nothing remarkable to the casual eye. It's wood, weathered and scarred, bearing the marks of seasons and storms, a sentinel standing firm despite the passage of time. Yet, you know that beneath the faded red cross, something gentle will soon bloom. You kneel before it, fingers brushing against the rough grain, as if greeting an old friend, feeling the pulse of history held in the wood's quiet texture. Your brush dips lightly into the soft pool of muted paints, each color chosen with care to echo the quiet rhythms of this place, a delicate pale pink, the soft green of new leaves, and a hint of warm gold to catch the fading light. With each stroke, petals begin to unfurl slowly, opening in a quiet dance of color that seems to soften the very air around you. As you paint, the village around you exhales its own stories, the faint clink of a distant bell, the murmur of voices carried on the breeze, the rustling of tree branches, heavy with the weight of lingering blossoms. The evening is cool now, the temperature slipping just enough to make your breath visible in soft, fleeting clouds that dissolve like whispered secrets. You take a moment to feel the air on your skin, the gentle chill balancing the warmth of your work. The scent of oil and pigments mingling with the earthiness of moss growing near the door's base. Each petal you trace seems to hold a promise, a reminder that even in places marked by sorrow, life finds a way to stretch toward the light. The flowers you paint tonight are pianistful and tender, their petals layered like the pages of a well-loved book, each fold holding stories folded into their soft embrace. They seem to pulse with the glow of the fading sun, their colors deepening in the cool shadows, as if breathing alongside you. You imagine the hands that once passed through this threshold, the laughter and tears that echoed beneath the roof, and you wonder if your gentle blooms might carry a piece of those memories forward, sheltering them in quiet beauty. The brush moves with a rhythm born of habit and reverence, a slow weaving of color that feels less like an act of painting and more like a delicate conversation between you and the door itself. When the last stroke is laid down, you sit back on your heels, your fingers trembling slightly from the steady work and the weight of all that these doors hold. The evening sky has deepened to a velvet blue, the stars now scattered in soft clusters across the heavens, and you can hear the distant sound of a nightingale beginning its song, a single note that rises and falls like a sigh. The door before you no longer carries the harsh mark of warning, but wears instead a gentle cloak of blossoms, a quiet testament to resilience and the slow unfolding of hope. You gather your brushes carefully, the worn handles familiar in your grasp, and close your satchel with a soft snap, the sound swallowed quickly by the gathering night. As you rise and begin to walk back through the shadowed streets, the glow from lantern windows spills softly onto the cobblestones, painting pools of amber light that sway gently with the night breeze. The scent of wood smoke curls around corners, mingling with the faint perfume of blooming honeysuckle climbing a nearby wall. Your footsteps fall into a gentle rhythm, matching the slow pulse of the village settling into rest. And you carry with you the quiet joy of creation, the small but profound gift of beauty, born from a hand that knows both loss and love. Tomorrow and the day after will bring more doors, more silent stories waiting to be touched by the brush, and you will return to them, step by step, petal by petal, weaving a quiet tapestry of light into the fabric of the night. You stand again before a door that bears the quiet weight of absence, the wood worn smooth by seasons, and the careful passing of hands long since still. The evening sun, low and tender, slips through the thin veil of clouds, casting a soft glow that pools warmly at your feet and rises to touch the weathered surface with a light that feels almost like a blessing. The air carries the scent of damp moss and the faint sweetness of dried lavender tucked beneath loose stones in forgotten corners, mingling with the subtle, comforting aroma of paint and linseed oil that clings to your fingers. You pause to breathe deeply, feeling the coolness of the breeze brush across your skin, and the steady rhythm of your heart beating in the quiet space between moments. This door is different from the others, not because of the marks it wears, but because of the stories you imagine behind it. Stories spoken in hushed voices, told beside hearths long cold, woven into the grain of the wood like threads in a tapestry. As you set your satchel down and uncurl your brushes, you feel a familiar calm settle over you, the kind that comes only from the ritual of creation, the slow unfolding of something gentle and alive beneath your hand. The paint is cool and thick against the bristles, a muted palette of soft peaches and creamy whites. The colors chosen to echo the warm glow of dusk and the fragile beauty of blossoms pressed between the pages of a book. Your brush moves with deliberate grace, tracing the delicate curves of cherry blossoms opening into the fading light. Each petal seems to breathe under your touch, their edges blurring softly into the wood like a whispered promise of renewal. You can almost hear the faint rustle of petals in a breeze, the distant murmur of birds settling for night, the gentle creak of old hinges resting after a day's work. The blossoms gather in loose clusters, their slender stems twisting upward, as if reaching toward the stars now beginning to sparkle overhead. The warmth of the sun lingers in the paint, catching the light with a subtle shimmer, while the shadows deepen the spaces between flowers into quiet, restful places. As you work, you feel yourself drawn into the stillness of the moment, the world narrowing until it is only you, the door, and the slow, soothing dance of color and light. The scent of fresh paint mingles with the cool earthiness of nearby ferns and the faint smoke drifting from distant chimneys, wrapping around you like a soft shawl against the coming night. The village itself seems to exhale gently, the distant calls of a few remaining voices folding into the hush of twilight, the stars above shimmering faintly through the last pale wisps of cloud. You think of the hands that once opened this door, the footsteps that passed through, the laughter and tears carried within these walls, and you paint not to erase, but to honor, to cradle those memories in petals that will bloom long after voices have faded. When the last stroke falls into place, you sit back on your heels, your fingers trembling slightly with the slow release of concentration and care. The door no longer carries the stark symbol of fear, but wears instead a gentle mantle of blossoms, a quiet celebration of life's enduring tenderness, even in places marked by loss. You gather your brushes, the worn wood smooth and warm beneath your fingertips, and carefully tuck them into your satchel. The evening air has cooled further now, the first chill of night brushing softly against your skin as the village lights begin to glow like fireflies in the deepening dark. Rising slowly, you take one last look at the door bathed in the soft moonlight, the petals faintly shimmering with the memory of the day's sun. The silence around you is full, not empty, but filled with the presence of those who came before, their stories folded gently into the fabric of the night. You carry this silence with you as you walk away, footsteps quiet on the stones, your breath mingling with the cool air, and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another door, another chance to weave beauty into the quiet places waiting patiently for your touch. The morning unfolds in a hush of pale light, soft and tentative as a secret whispered between old friends. You step out into the cool air, still touched by the lingering chill of night, and the world feels quiet as if it's waiting, holding its breath for the day to slowly reveal itself. Beneath your feet, the cobblestones are damp and dark, glistening faintly with the remnants of dew, and the scent of earth and wild herbs drifts softly on the breeze, a gentle reminder of growth and quiet persistence. You carry your satchel carefully, the familiar weight settling against your side like a steady heartbeat, and you find yourself drawn to a lane that seems almost forgotten, where the shadows lean long and the houses stand close, their windows shuttered and their walls whispering of days long past. Before you lies a door that bears the unmistakable mark of Soroa, faded red cross, roughly drawn and weathered by rain and time, a silent warning to those who might approach. Yet beneath that mark, you see the rough grain of the wood, yearning for something gentler, a softness that will transform fear into something like hope. Kneeling before it, you let your fingers brush the surface, feeling the texture of, yet porous and ready to receive the touch of your brush. The air around you is cool, but not cold, carrying with it the faintest scent of lavender and worn leather. Mingling with the earthy aroma of crushed pine needles from a nearby hedge, you pause for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the quiet settle into your bones before dipping your brush into the pale colors waiting in your bowl. Soft creams, muted greens, and a delicate blush pink that reminds you of dawn's first light on a fragile blossom. Your brush moves slowly, deliberately, each stroke coaxing a blossom into life. This time, a spray of wild cherry blossoms, their petals delicate and fleeting, unfolding like whispered memories pressed between pages. The paint is cool against the wood, thick but yielding, and as you work, you feel a rhythm grow between you and the door, a silent conversation told in curves and shades of color. The blossoms gather in clusters, their stems twisting lightly as if stirred by a gentle breeze you cannot see, and their petals seem to shimmer faintly in the early morning light, soft and luminous, as if holding onto a secret only the dawn could reveal. Around you, the village stirs with the slow awakening of life, birds calling softly from distant trees, the faint clatter of shutters being opened, the smell of baking bread beginning to rise from chimneys and drift through the air like a promise. There is a quiet reverence in the way you paint, as though each flower carries the weight of stories not spoken aloud, hands that once opened this door, of voices that once filled the rooms beyond, of love and loss intertwined beneath layers of dust and time. The coolness of the morning air brushes gently against your cheeks, and you feel the steady pulse of your own breath mingling with the soft sounds of the village waking around you. The scent of oil and paint blends seamlessly with the earth and greenery, creating a fragrance that feels both new and ancient, a balm for the heart that has learned to carry its grief with grace. When the last petal takes its place, you sit back for a moment, the brush resting lightly in your fingers, and you let your eyes drink in the transformed door. No longer a symbol of fear and isolation, it now wears a quiet beauty, a gentle bloom of wild cherry blossoms that seem to breathe life into the wood, softening its edges and inviting a new kind of remembrance. The world feels still, wrapped in the fragile promise of this new day, and you carry with you the sense that, even in places marked by absence, there can be beauty that endures, delicate, tender, and infinitely resilient. You gather your things slowly, the soft clink of your jars and the rustle of your cloth, the only sounds in the awakening lane, and you rise to walk away with a heart slightly lighter, the memory of petals and morning light folded gently within you like a whispered prayer. The village carries on around you, its streets filling with the soft murmur of footsteps and voices. But you carry the quiet bloom of your work into the day, knowing that somewhere, beyond this door and many others, life will find a way to carry its own gentle light forward. The sky stretches wide and deep above you, a soft vault of muted blues fading gradually into the tender purple of early evening, where the first stars hesitate before blooming fully into night. You find yourself walking slowly through the village once more, the familiar weight of your satchel at your side, filled with paints and brushes that have become extensions of your very self. The air around you is cool, but not biting, carrying the gentle scent of damp leaves and distant lilacs, a delicate perfume that seems to hold the secret of 1,000 quiet moments. Beneath your feet, the cobblestones hum softly with the memory of countless footsteps, worn smooth by the passage of time and the stories that have gathered here like dust on old shelves. Ahead, a door waits in patient silence beneath a thick wooden lintel, its surface worn and pocked. The faded red cross, a stark reminder of a time when fear lived in every corner and whispered in every shadow. You kneel before it, your fingers tracing the rough grain as if greeting an old companion, feeling the texture warm from the day's sun and yet softened by the gentle caress of evening air. The brush in your hand feels alive, its bristles tender and familiar as you dip it into a bowl of soft yellows and creamy whites, hues that remind you of late summer sunlight filtering through worn curtains and the quiet bloom of daisies in forgotten fields. With deliberate care, you begin to paint each stroke a gentle unfolding of daisies, their petals thin and fragile, trembling lightly in an unseen breeze. The paint is cool and thick, settling smoothly into the weathered wood, carrying with it the warmth of sunlight and the whisper of fields where wildflowers sway with the rhythm of the wind. The stems and leaves curl softly, twisting with an effortless grace, and the flowers cluster close as if seeking comfort in one another's presence. Around you, the village exhales a quiet lullaby, the rustle of branches above the distant murmur of voices softened by twilight, and the faint scent of fresh bread cooling on windowsills, mingling with the earthy perfume of moss and stone. As your brush moves, you imagine the stories behind this door, the hands that once reached for it, the laughter that might have echoed through the rooms beyond, and the silent tears that never found their voice. The daisies become a quiet celebration of resilience and tender hope, their soft colors brightening the worn surface like small beacons against the fading light. The evening cools around you, a gentle hush settling like a soft shawl, and you feel the steady beat of your own breath blending with the rhythm of the night. The scent of paint mingles with the faint trace of lavender tucked into your satchel, a soothing balm for a heart that has learned to carry both grief and grace. When the final petal is set, you sit back on your heels, eyes resting on the door now transformed into a gentle bloom of light and life. The daisies seem to glow faintly in the twilight, their colors softened by the dusk and deepened by the quiet promise of night. The village settles softly around youth, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of leaves in the cooling breeze, and the soft glow of lanterns beginning to flicker in windows like watchful stars. You gather your brushes with a tender reverence, the familiar feel of worn wood warm in your hands, and rise slowly to walk away, carrying with you the stillness of the moment and the knowledge that even in places touched by sorrow, beauty can bloom again. The sky stretches wide and deep above you, a soft vault of muted blues fading gradually into the tender purple of early evening, where the first stars hesitate before blooming fully into night. You find yourself walking slowly through the village once more, the familiar weight of your satchel at your side, filled with paints and brushes that have become extensions of your very self. The air around you is cool but not biting, carrying the gentle scent of damp leaves and distant lilacs, a delicate perfume that seems to hold the secret of 1,000 quiet moments. Beneath your feet, the cobblestones hum softly with the memory of countless footsteps, worn smooth by the passage of time and the stories that have gathered here like dust on old shelves. Ahead, a door waits in patient silence beneath a thick wooden lintel, its surface worn and pocked. The faded red cross, a stark reminder of a time when fear lived in every corner and whispered in every shadow. You kneel before it, your fingers tracing the rough grain as if greeting an old companion, feeling the texture warm from the day's sun and yet softened by the gentle caress of evening air. The brush in your hand feels alive, its bristles tender and familiar as you dip it into a bowl of soft yellows and creamy whites, hues that remind you of late summer sunlight filtering through worn curtains and the quiet bloom of daisies in forgotten fields. With deliberate care, you begin to paint each stroke a gentle unfolding of daisies, their petals thin and fragile, trembling lightly in an unseen breeze. The paint is cool and thick, settling smoothly into the weathered wood, carrying with it the warmth of sunlight and the whisper of fields where wildflowers sway with the rhythm of the wind. The stems and leaves curl softly, twisting with an effortless grace, and the flowers cluster close as if seeking comfort in one another's presence. Around you, the village exhales a quiet lullaby, the rustle of branches above the distant murmur of voices softened by twilight, and the faint scent of fresh bread cooling on windowsills, mingling with the earthy perfume of moss and stone. As your brush moves, you imagine the stories behind this door, the hands that once reached for it, the laughter that might have echoed through the rooms beyond, and the silent tears that never found their voice. The daisies become a quiet celebration of resilience and tender hope, their soft colors brightening the worn surface like small beacons against the fading light. The evening cools around you, a gentle hush settling like a soft shawl, and you feel the steady beat of your own breath blending with the rhythm of the night. The scent of paint mingles with the faint trace of lavender tucked into your satchel, a soothing balm for a heart that has learned to carry both grief and grace. When the final petal is set, you sit back on your heels, eyes resting on the door now transformed into a gentle bloom of light and life. The daisies seem to glow faintly in the twilight, their colors softened by the dusk and deepened by the quiet promise of night. The village settles softly around you, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of leaves in the cooling breeze, and the soft glow of lanterns beginning to flicker in windows like watchful stars. You gather your brushes with a tender reverence, the familiar feel of worn wood warm in your hands, and rise slowly to walk away, carrying with you the stillness of the moment and the knowledge that even in places touched by sorrow, beauty can bloom again. The night settles around you like a soft, velvety cloak, its deep indigo sky scattered with stars that shimmer faintly, like tiny lanterns hung by unseen hands to guide the way home. You walk slowly through the village's sleeping streets, the cobblestones cool and smooth beneath your feet, their worn surfaces whispering the gentle secrets of countless quiet nights. The air is still and fragrant with the scent of honeysuckle and night-blooming jasmine, their delicate perfumes weaving a tender lullaby that wraps softly around your senses. You carry with you the weight of your satchel, now light with the day's work, the faint clink of empty jars, a subtle echo in the hush. Ahead, the last door awaits, framed by climbing ivy whose leaves glisten with the soft touch of moonlight, silvering the edges like a fine embroidery. The wood is aged and marked by time, the faded red cross, almost invisible beneath the gentle shadows, as if it too is ready to be forgotten. You kneel before it with reverence, your fingers tracing the worn grain, feeling the quiet pulse of history held within its fibers. Your brush dips into soft shades of lavender and cream, colors chosen to soothe and calm, like whispered prayers folded into petals. Slowly, carefully, you begin to paint a cluster of lilacs, their tiny blossoms spilling in delicate sprays, each one a gentle nod to renewal and remembrance. The paint flows smooth and cool beneath your brush, the lilacs unfolding in quiet elegance, their fragrance seeming to rise from the wood itself, an imagined sweetness that mingles with the night air and the distant murmur of a lullaby carried by the wind. The flowers curve and sway softly, their slender stems entwined as if holding each other close against the dark, their colors deepening gently in the moonlight to a shade both tender and resolute. Around you, the village breathes in the stillness, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft creak of an old shutter moved by the breeze, and the distant, soothing murmur of the river threading its way beyond the hills. As you work, your thoughts drift like clouds across a twilight sky, touching on memories woven through the lives that once filled these houses, the laughter of children chasing fireflies on warm summer nights, the quiet strength of hands that built and mended, the soft sorrow of farewells whispered beneath these very stars. You paint not only to cover the mark of fear, but to kindle a light of gentle hope, a quiet promise that beauty endures, even in the shadow of loss. The lilacs bloom softly beneath your touch, each petal a small miracle of color and light, folding tenderly into the night's embrace. When the last blossom is set, you pause, the brush resting lightly in your hand as you gaze upon the transformed door. It no longer carries the harsh symbol of plague and isolation, but wears instead a wreath of lilacs, fragrant and full of quiet grace. The village around you lies hushed beneath a blanket of stars, and you feel the steady beat of your heart in the stillness, a calm pulse that carries you gently forward. Rising slowly, you gather your brushes and satchel, the familiar weight grounding you even as the world seems to lift in peaceful promise. As you walk away down the silent lane, the scent of lilacs lingers faintly, a tender trace of your presence woven into the night air. The doors you have touched will stand now as quiet monuments, petals blooming where once there was fear, stories whispered in color and light, and a widow's gentle hand weaving hope into the fabric of a village that remembers not only sorrow but the enduring beauty of care and remembrance. The night deepens softly around you, and you carry this quiet journey within you, a memory like a soft flame glowing steadily as the world turns toward dawn. If you ever wish to revisit this story or explore another gentle tale, I will be here, ready to guide you once more through the whispered worlds of quiet wonder. And so, as the last light drapes itself softly across the street, and the painted flowers seem to breathe in the evening air, you stand a while longer, letting the quiet settle deep within you. The world beyond this place may never know the name of the woman whose hands traced petals, where there once was only fear, yet here, in the hush of your own remembering, she is alive in every color, every gentle curve of the brush, every door that now carries the memory of her kindness. You step away slowly, as though not to wake the sleeping houses, and the cool air follows you like a shawl, carrying with it the faint scent of paint and summer blossoms, a reminder that even in the shadow of loss, beauty can still take root and bloom.